Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
We will, of course, be discussing Brexit this morning, although at first glance it's hard to determine precisely how. I have to tell you, I'm minded to apologise, because although I have tried my very best to predict every twist and turn of this whole sorry saga, and although I have held the likes of Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg in the very lowest of regards for the longest time, I'm afraid even I didn't actually contemplate, let alone countenance, the depths of moral depravity to which they are now stooping. It is quite incredible. Of all the things that we've wrestled with and wriggled with on this programme over the last 3 years, nigh on, the idea that the two men who have done the most to scupper both Theresa May's leadership, of course, Jacob Rees-Mogg felt compelled to try to overthrow her, so poor was her so-called withdrawal agreement, as long ago only as last December. Boris Johnson has done little but hurl abuse from the sidelines and resign as Foreign Secretary effectively over the constraints of the so-called withdrawal agreement, albeit that it hadn't actually been written down when he ran for the hills. It was clear when he fled post-Chequers that it was clear what the terms would be. And these two men now, these two moral vacuums, these intellectual ciphers, these stains upon the history of our parliamentary democracy are now poised to turn around and vote for something they have described variously as vassalage and slavery. I kind of want you to tell me how that is allowed to happen in British democracy. How two men, two old Etonians, I mentioned that in passing, as I've said to you many, many times, in the style of a 1970s racist talking about people of colour. Some of my best friends are old Etonians. But it is genuinely breathtaking. I thought that my capacity to be shocked had been exhausted. For example, when the utterly absurd Suella Braverman spoke yesterday of cultural Marxism, a phrase beloved of Nazis and previously confined to the darker corners of the internet where racist wazzocks essentially pleasure each other in pursuit of who can be the most ignorant and vile. To see that move into the political mainstream, I'm very sorry to tell you, didn't shock me. It seemed to me the perfectly predictable next step of somebody who's embarked upon a political path built upon prejudice and ignorance. Where else could it ultimately lead? But Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg, essentially now, in the case of Boris Johnson, flirting, in the case of Jacob Rees-Mogg, poised to vote for a withdrawal agreement that they have described in the most negative, pejorative, and cutting of terms. And just let's all pause for a moment and park our previous positions, regardless of how we voted. The idea that there was anything to recommend the position that Rees-Mogg and Johnson adopted prior to this week is perfectly plausible, right? I believe the overwhelming weight of contribution and evidence from the qualified and the expert, but nothing's certain until it happens. You know, as that great political sage Lenny Kravitz once famously observed, it ain't over till it's over. And so anything could have happened. And those two men stood on the very centre of the political stage and swore blind that this so-called withdrawal agreement was pretty much the end of civilization as we know it. Their supporters, the poor, deluded saps, who tug their forelocks and doff their caps whenever somebody with a pantomime posh accent deigns to turn their monocle towards them. Those poor, poor people lied to in 2016, lied to in 2017, lied to in 2018, and then, to crown it all, in 2019, Jacob Rees-Mogg climbs to the top of a tower and urinates all over them. And what do? That's the bit I don't know. My portrayal of the cap-doffing forelock tuggers over the last couple of years has been very, very, very unkind, and deliberately and necessarily so. But I've got a horrible feeling today they will thank J-Dog, the monocled sputineer. They will thank him for urinating all over them, and very quickly claim that that's what they voted for all along. So if I am ordinarily somebody that you take to social media every morning to insist that you don't listen to, and then tune in slavishly for the next 3 hours, if you are somebody who I would routinely describe as a forelock tugger and a cap-doffer, I wonder if I could possibly tempt you onto the programme today to just tell me whether or not you're going to thank Jacob Rees-Mogg for weeing all over you and treating you like a complete imbecile, secure in the knowledge that you'll still be cheering him, or whether actually today is the morning on which you go, oh my days, it turns out that Rees-Mogg is actually even less trustworthy than the rest of them. I don't know how you process this, emotionally or intellectually. If you've spent 3 years getting cross with everybody, you've slowly, it's like a rising tide of crossness, because voting for an impossible dream is only ever going to end in disappointment. So who are you going to blame for that, if not yourself? So you slowly see the tide rising. Who gets the blame? We must blame them. It's all Theresa May's fault. It's Ollie Robbins' fault. And so you just have this narrowing of faces until the only people that you admire or trust, actually, crucial word, you've been pushed to this place where the only politicians that you feel were representing you were Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson. Today's not the day to point out how ridiculous you were to be led into that position. I have nothing but sympathy for you, as you know, contempt for the conmen, compassion, and nothing else for the conned. But I'd love to speak to people today who still think they haven't been conned, as Jacob Rees-Mogg affects the mother of all U-turns and prepares himself to vote for something which he himself has described as slavery and vassalage, and which Boris Johnson, I am 99.9% sure, I probably should have searched for the reference before coming on air this morning. Of course, if this was the BBC, I'd have a team of researchers doing so for me. But I'm pretty sure Boris Johnson has described the withdrawal agreement as being worse than staying in the European Union. So Boris Johnson today, who retains prime ministerial ambitions, has his sights still set on number 10 Downing Street. Boris Johnson is preparing to deliberately and consciously vote for something, should the opportunity arise, which is of course far from a given, which he considers to be worse for this country than membership of the European Union. Those are the two angles I'd love to explore with you today. Whether or not the forelock-tugging tendencies of some of the British electorate are so entrenched and embedded that they will even now be looking at Jacob Rees-Mogg as somebody worthy of their respect and affection, even as he urinates all over them while laughing like a pantomime villain. 03456060973. And then to Boris Johnson, and the fact that he has stated on the record that the withdrawal agreement is worse than membership. I'm pretty sure. And now he's going to vote for it. How do you reconcile yourself to that reality? How does he? Are you going to approve of him voting for the withdrawal agreement? Because the alternative would be remaining in the European Union, which he thinks is demonstrably superior to the terms and conditions of the withdrawal agreement that he's poised to vote for. I know what the new fig leaf is. How many fig leaves? Do you remember when we stopped counting the fig leaves? The little phrases or the misinformation, the nuggets of misinformation that they serve up to the faithful in order to rescue them from the pain of thinking and understanding things. So you give a little phrase like leave means leave, or Brexit means Brexit, or take back control, or we want our country back, or passports and fish, or whatever the phrase may be, and then it moves into the nuggets of misinformation, like Article 24 of GATT, which has been utterly rubbished by people who know what they're talking about, but continues to be cited by people who don't as a realistic prospect. This week we saw an utter farrago of lies about the Lisbon Treaty going viral on social media, and even people intelligent enough to listen to this programme, falling for the nonsense therein. So you keep handing people these nuggets of misinformation, or these fatuous, empty phrases, because then when they're asked difficult questions, like, what the hell are you doing? They can reply by saying, oh, GATT 24, or Article this, or Lisbon Treaty on Facebook. That's the bit that eventually will fall apart, all of it. And it has. And the people, the Pied Pipers are now preparing to vote for the withdrawal agreement that you have fallen out with friends and family over your vociferous opposition to. I just would love to know, at risk of sounding like Kevin Keegan, I'd love to know how did you just not bother? Is that where the cognitive dissonance and the switch in your brain becomes really, really helpful? You just turn it off. And actually thinking facts, evidence doesn't matter. I will still be cheering for Jacob Rees-Mogg even as he urinates upon me, my family and my future from the greatest height. And I know that this probably isn't the most obvious receptacle for you to pour your heart into this morning. But where else are you going to go? Seriously. At least with me, you get a comforting arm around your shoulder, and you know that I have prepared you for this moment. I have portrayed Rees-Mogg as possessing the morals of a cut snake. I have reminded you time and time again that Boris Johnson can be trusted even less far than you could throw him. And now you know I was right. You're welcome. There it is, an act of hypocrisy, and to use his own word, not a word I like employing, except when describing people seeking the help of foreign governments to undermine the parliament of their own country, treachery. We'll stick with hypocrisy, moral corruption, dishonesty. Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson prepare to support parliamentary legislation that they have described variously as vassalage and slavery, and perhaps most importantly for our purposes this morning, inferior to retaining membership of the European Union in Johnson's case. I just want to know how you square that, if you felt that they were on your side previously. And of course, if you still do, then the contortions you must currently be undertaking presumably demand limbs of elastic. Darren's in Woking. Darren, what's going on?
We've spoken a couple of times, James. Nervous to speak to you, as always, especially as a leaver. Can I quickly say that your consolatory tone recently has really helped people like me engaging again with your show. I hope that doesn't sound patronising, but it become a bit confrontational at times and a hard sort of place to listen.
Well, of course it was a hard place to listen if you voted for this madness and are still pretending that it was a good idea. But anyway,
and James, I listen to be challenged. So
yes,
I'm not...
Darren, I love you like a brother, mate, but this little bromance is not going to be of interest to the million people listening every week. So grateful though I am for your advice. Let's crack on with why you rang in.
Right, so pro-EU supporter ended up voting leave. We've spoken before. I explained that the reason for that was I believe if we voted Remain, our cherry-pick deal will be eroded over times to come, decades to come. Right, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Boris Johnson are people that I walk on the opposite side of the road to politically. It has been very hard with people like that being the people that represent my views as a Brexiter. I've always had to hold my nose and put up with the stench because I'm not aligned to them normally, and it's one of the biggest things that's made me question about whether I made the right decision to vote to leave. I'm furious with Jacob Rees-Mogg and people like that because I ultimately bought into listening to those sort of people because I bought into the argument and the belief that through Brexit, although there were big bonds, that they would open the other doors to different pros. And therefore, their argument was always based on bettering our country. Whether you agree with it or not, it was about making our country better.
Well, you believed that. I mean, many of us never did. Some of us thought it was about self-enrichment. Some of us thought it was about advancing prime ministerial ambitions. But I completely respect that your right to believe that they were acting in the best interests of the country, just as you respect my right to think that you are a little bit gullible for falling for it.
I wouldn't put it quite as simplistically as that, because that implies I buy into everything. No,
it doesn't. Just the idea that you thought they were acting in the best interest of the country. I don't.
Not solely,
you do. But we're never going to settle that score, except, of course, with the evidence.
Everyone's always going to have a personal interest, a vested interest. So, no, not solely. But in this specific part of what I'm saying,
yes,
I believe that they had a genuine belief that Brexit opened doors for our nations that would enrich our country. Now, for him now to move to a position where he will hold his nose and vote for the Withdrawal Act, then let me just sort of remind people, is Brino, makes us a vassal state, traps us in a
stay there, Darren. Stay there, Darren. You don't need to do this from memory. Okay, well, I'll be back with you in a moment. There's a couple of phone lines free if you want to crack on. 0345 606 0973. We don't have to rely on Darren's memory because we got this.
It's vassal state stuff. We are going to, for the first time in 1,000 years, this parliament will not have a say over the laws that govern this country. So I don't see how you can support it from a democratic point of view. I don't see how a unionist can support it, and I don't see how you can support it if you believe in the political economic freedom of this country. So if you ask my question, am I going to vote against it, the answer is yes.
And then, of course, we've also got this.
People voted to leave, they didn't vote for a deal. This deal leaves us potentially tied into a customs union indefinitely, subject to the European Court of Justice in certain areas potentially indefinitely, and splits up the United Kingdom between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This is not a question of people like me letting you down. It is of the government having come up with a deal that does not deliver on the manifesto of 2017 or the referendum of 2016.
I suppose he's right in a way. Darren's dropped off. We'll get him back up momentarily. In the meantime, Edward's in Salisbury. Edward, where do you stand on these two characters?
I stand a firm supporter behind both characters, actually.
Sorry, I just need to clarify. Supporting them when they said it was slavery, vassalage, and they definitely wouldn't vote for it, or supporting them now when they're saying that they will? Because you can't do both, can you?
Yeah, I can, mate. I'm supporting them in both scenarios.
So you're supporting them when they said they wouldn't vote for it, and you're supporting them when they said they would vote for it?
Yeah, because I now believe they're now on their last leg, and they've got to support it to get us out of the EU. It's now looking like the only way we're going to leave, and
but they both, well, certainly Boris Johnson said that it was worse than being in the EU. So when he's voting for something that he thinks is going to make things worse for you than they already are, you support him even though he's told you to your face.
I do, and purely because of the fact that he's listening to the British vote that we left. It's democratic, isn't it? At the end of the day, he's now realised there's no alternative option.
But then that means you couldn't. That means you couldn't support them before, when you did.
Well, it does, though, because I supported them then because it was looking like there was more options on the table. There was still potential no-deal Brexit was going to happen. It's now clear that the MPs are not going to get behind that. And what's most frustrating beyond all is these two honourable gentlemen now are having to support this deal just so that we can get out of the EU. So being forced into a corner.
If they're being honourable after the U-turn and they were honourable before the U-turn, in what circumstances do you think you might have been forced to conclude that they were dishonourable, Edward?
They've not been dishonourable.
No. This is what I'm theorising about. Circumstances in which you would be able to perhaps contemplate the possibility that they'd been dishonourable, because you've got them down as honourable before a U-turn, a public humiliation and hypocritical U-turn. You've got them as honourable after that. You're in support of what they've told you is slavery and vassalage and a betrayal of the vote in 2016. I understand all of that, but we're talking about the men today, not the tired old catchphrases that, maybe apart from small corners of Salisbury, have completely fallen apart in the light of reality. I'm just wondering if there's anything you can imagine them doing that you would personally describe as dishonourable.
Yes, supporting. If they were to support anything that kept us within the EU, then I would consider them as dishonourable.
So when they said that deal does effectively keep us in the EU in all but name. How do you square that one morally, just out of interest?
At least we're out in name. Do you know what I mean? At least that.
I think I know what you mean, Edward. I'm not entirely sure that you do. Back to Darren. We played a couple of quotes there, Darren. So we're clear on they have described what they are about to vote for in the most negative and pejorative of terms. Don't you feel like a bit of a mug for going along with them?
Voting Leave and consequently thinking about it every day and genuinely being prepared to change my mind if I thought it was the wrong decision. And it has been really hard at times. I've been very close to being there.
Yes.
It's been the hardest 3 years of my life.
I'm sure.
Do I feel like a mug? And I mean that with a heavy... It has been hard.
I
really
believe you,
hard.
mate. I can hear it in your voice.
Do I believe I'm a mug for believing them? No, I think they are disgraceful people who ultimately are prepared to do anything to, inverted commas, get us out of the European Union. And Edward, who you're just speaking to there, Edward, if you're listening, you've got to understand that what these people are doing now is selling out and saying they are prepared to get us out of the EU for any cost, no matter what it leaves our nation state like moving forward, just to achieve us getting out of the EU. Don't believe that it's the only option. A long-term extension does not mean the Brexit doesn't necessarily happen.
So you still, even after all of this, you still think Brexit is a good idea or a desirable...
Please give me 30 seconds. I know you've given me a long time. Give me 30 seconds. Look, one of the main reasons I thought that we could operate outside of the EU was to sign our own international trade agreements. Not long after Article 50 was triggered, the EU announced a deal with Japan.
Yes.
It was a hammer blow, and it was a realisation.
No, it had been under negotiation for over 5 years, Darren. It shouldn't have taken you by surprise, mate.
No, I know. But what I mean by being a hammer blow is what I'm coming to realise is that was the wrong decision. So fast forward, all of the wrong decisions I took. You use the word holding the hands. My worry is now, if we don't somehow do Brexit, how are we going to cuddle the people? It's going to destroy this country. Those people that did not vote before the EU referendum...
The answer to your question is have another vote. It's the only answer to all the points you've raised. It shuts everyone up. Have another vote, utterly final vote with a lot more information in front of us. For you, well, that's not for us to decide, but if I was in charge, it would have to be a choice between the withdrawal agreement as it is, which people like Edward, of course, think is a sign of positivity, or remaining. And no one can argue about that anymore.
To me.
Why not?
You can't do that to me because the Withdrawal Act does not represent what I voted for as a leaver. And I know argument that there was 10 different reasons.
No, but what you voted for as a lever was impossible to achieve.
I disagree with that, because if you look at the guy, who's the guy that wrote Article 50? You had him on the show.
Kerr.
Lord Kerr, thank you. You said to him once that he couldn't, nothing. Look, you're right when you talk about Theresa May's red lines mean that this is the only negotiated withdrawal.
Yes.
That is true. Okay, but if there had been a national conversation with the right brains in the first instance, I mean, we're going over old trodden ground here, where we actually found a realisation that to achieve what everyone wanted from Brexit would result in the Withdrawal Act, which I agree with is pretty much the only negotiated terms to withdraw, there may have been a movement, and people like me may have been able to show that we were prepared to compromise. What's happened?
I'm late for the news. I've given you loads and loads of time, Darren, and I'm grateful for your input. I've understood most of it, but that bottom line there about the red lines and another referendum, the red lines were rendered necessary by the obsession with immigration and free movement. The obsession with immigration and free movement rendered the red lines necessary. The red lines, when they met the Good Friday Agreement, made the current withdrawal agreement the best available. Full stop. So now we know that unless you're going to re-campaign without having immigration on the menu, then there's no other choice but to just let people have another go. Now, Jacob Rees-Mogg is allowed to change his mind publicly, describe it himself as treachery, get given the front page of the Daily Mail as a form of sort of mea culpa. You, Darren, in Woking, no, mate, you've got to stick by a decision you made 3 years ago when you knew a fraction of what you know now. How the hell is that fair? I think it's probably important to get everything absolutely clear, don't you? We're discussing... it's a little personal today. We're discussing people rather than politics and policies. We're discussing the conduct of two politicians, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson, vying with each other for the title of most morally corrupt. And when you consider how crowded the field is on the side of so-called arch Brexiters, then you'd realise what an achievement it is to have been whittled down to the final two. And the reason for these contemplations and conversations is very, very simple. They are both now poised to support a withdrawal agreement. They may not, for the record. Rees-Mogg still sort of whining about the DUP. Johnson presumably still calculating everything according to what's most likely to advance his own ambitions. But they are publicly flirting with the idea. Rees-Mogg even more so at this point than Johnson. So I think it's important to remind ourselves precisely what they think about the legislation they're now poised to vote for. It doesn't actually matter what I think about it, and what you think about it is today less important. It's very important to be clear on what they think about the deal that they are now publicly lending support to. Okay, so from the top.
People voted to leave, they didn't vote for a deal. This deal leaves us potentially tied into a customs union indefinitely, subject to the European Court of Justice in certain areas potentially indefinitely, and splits up the United Kingdom between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This is not a question of people like me letting you down. It is of the government having come up with a deal that does not deliver on the manifesto of 2017 or the referendum of 2016.
Well, you know, everyone has a bad day.
Let's cut to the chase. Will you support her Brexit deal now?
Of course I won't. Her Brexit deal is dreadful.
Will you resign the whip?
No, I'm not going to resign the whip. The Brexit we were getting in the withdrawal agreement was not a proper Brexit. Nothing is going to be worse than what we were being offered.
Oh, let's have that one again. And I promise I won't do too many repeats, but that little killer line at the end there, nothing is worse than what we're being offered. That's when people like Edward in Salisbury need to give their head a wobble. This honourable man is describing what he's doing as the worst of all available options, including remaining in the European Union, something that Boris Johnson has explicitly described as better than the terms of the deal he's now thinking of voting for. So, once more with feeling.
Let's cut to the chase. Will you support her Brexit deal now?
Of course I won't. Her Brexit deal is dreadful.
Will you resign the whip?
No, I'm not going to resign the whip. The Brexit we were getting in the withdrawal agreement was not a proper Brexit. Nothing is going to be worse than what we were being offered.
Well, at least he's always been loyal to the leader and the government.
It looks very likely that the government will lose the withdrawal agreement, and it's a bad agreement, so that's a good thing. It keeps us tied into the European Union. We'd pay £39 billion for nothing very much, and would split the United Kingdom between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. So defeating the agreement is a good thing.
It's almost as if, and this is, of course, the hardest pill to swallow for the forelock tuggers and the capped offers, it's almost as if he's not very bright. Isn't it?
That it is not so much the vassal state anymore as the slave state. In this arrangement, we can only leave the customs union with the permission of the European Union, which is a worse situation than we're currently in.
And what people who aren't very bright generally do when they're seeking to camouflage their lack of understanding is reach for extreme language, like the language you just heard. But, you know, it's not just Jacob.
It's vassal state stuff. We are going to, for the first time in 1,000 years, this parliament will not have a say over the laws that govern this country. So I don't see how you can support it from a democratic point of view. I don't see how a unionist can support it, and I don't see how you can support it if you believe in the political economic freedom of this country. So if you ask my question, am I going to vote against it? The answer is yes.
Just to be on the safe side, are we sure that was Boris Johnson and not Rory Bremner? Have we got any more footage of him saying similar or possibly even identical stuff?
We're on the verge of making a historic mistake. And I just say this, unless we change course, we are going to stay in the customs union, we're going to stay in the single market, and we're going to be rules takers. And unless we junk this backstop, we are going to find that Brussels has got us exactly where they want us.
That's a lie. Brussels wants us in the European Union, of course, as full participating members. What Boris Johnson revealed there, and this is genuinely astonishing when you properly pause to contemplate it, what Boris Johnson is describing there is the United Kingdom being turned into precisely the nation that they claimed we were when they were persuading us to leave the European Union. This idea that we are beholden to externally imposed rules, regulations, even laws. This idea that we are powerless to promote our own voices and our own policies. That was a lie before the referendum, but it worked because many people voted to leave this non-existent tyranny. And now he's describing the withdrawal agreement that he's about to vote for in precisely the terms, accurately now, that he dishonestly deployed in the run-up to the referendum. What specifically does he think about the deal he's now thinking of supporting?
I do think that this deal is dead, and it's very important that that is recognised. You know, the reason it's been defeated so heavily is it's so evidently a bad deal for the UK.
There is, of course, some fear that what they are poised to do is vote for the withdrawal agreement in the hope of somehow later reneging on it, which, of course, sends a message to the rest of the world that the entire country is as trustworthy as Johnson and Rees-Mogg. Almost makes you wonder what their definition of democracy might be.
All this nonsense we would have to implement with no ability to change or resist. That is not pragmatic. That is not a compromise. It is dangerous and unstable, politically and economically. My fellow Conservatives, this is not democracy.
And there it is. We'll play that last one again, because I want you to hear what Boris Johnson, a man who still has designs on Downing Street, thinks apparently, and has publicly stated several times, about a bill that he is now poised to support.
All this nonsense we would have to implement with no ability to change or resist. That is not pragmatic. That is not a compromise. It is dangerous and unstable, politically and economically. My fellow Conservatives, this is not democracy.
So what is it then? 0345 6060 973. Roger and Paul, thank you for your patience. I'll be with you first up after the break. After them, it could, of course, be you. The question is, having heard those 8 excerpts from the public statements of these two men, how do you feel if you were, or possibly, as the lad in Salisbury reminded us is possible, still are, impressed by them, seduced by them, inspired by them? How can you hold on to that when they're now going to vote for the things they told you were the worst available options? It's a mystery, isn't it? And it's not even Thursday. We will not support the deal. It will turn us into a slave state. It's vassal state stuff. It's a historic mistake. It's a bad deal. It's dead. This is not democracy. All descriptions applied to Theresa May's so-called withdrawal agreement by two prominent advocates of Brexit, two extremely wealthy enemies of the elites, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson. So how come they get to do this and you don't get to change your mind? Given that you cast your vote nearly 3 years ago in circumstances that were far from optimal, corruption, criminality, foreign interference, and massive misrepresentation, not to mention racist scaremongering in the guise of that dismal breaking point poster. So now that we can see a little more clearly, and of course, if you still think it would be a good thing to do, I kind of get that in the sense of this feeling inside you that it is something to do with freedom that's been so successfully ceded by these chancellors. It doesn't make you a bad person. It makes them bad people, as is proved by the fact that they are now telling you that the thing they described as the worst possible option is the thing that they're minded to support. Just talk me through your emotional and intellectual processes in dealing with this. And you don't have to thank me for having prepared you for this betrayal and disappointment by pointing out repeatedly over the last 3 years that they were the charlatans in chief of the whole sorry project. Roger's in Woodford. Roger, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning. Well, I woke up early this morning, about 5 a.m, and I got on the news, and I saw what apparently Rees-Mogg has done. I was upset for 5-10 minutes, but the way politics is at the moment, you're not shocked at any of this. I mean, whatever side of the divide...
I was shocked by this. I got to be honest with you. And I mean, I presume you're a Leave voter, so you hold Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Yeah.
You hold Jacob Rees-Mogg in much higher regard than I do. I think he's as low as a snake morally, but I'm amazed you're not shocked by it. You heard all those clips.
So, you know...
Yes, but he's on your side. He's one of the leaders of your team.
Well, this withdrawal agreement is Remain minus. That's what I believe.
So do I.
I mean, I just want to say one thing. I read it, speedily over a few days, different sections, but I read every section. Article 132. Begins a very short article, and it begins about saying what Article 126 is the 2-year transition.
You might be in danger of losing the room here, Roger, but crack on.
But basically, it says that the transition can be extended till the end of 2099, 20XX. So that is something that if Rees-Mogg has been going on how he has been going on, he couldn't vote for this document, for this agreement, just because of that one article.
Well, I'm not 100% sure what you're referring to, but he is going to vote for it as things stand. He's taken out he's been gifted the front page of the Daily Mail. So I just want to take you back to...
If he's honourable, though,
but we know he isn't.
He should say, I've changed my mind, and therefore I should just go and do something else for a living.
Yes, but he's not honourable. He won't resign the whip. He needs the oxygen of publicity. He's drunk on the attention and the power. But I'm most interested in that thing you said at the outset about not being shocked. I mean, who's left then?
Both sides of this divide. I mean, I know that you're leaning against, the people who have apparently not been honest on the Leave side, but they're all over the place in Parliament.
There's nothing apparently about it, no, because we've narrowed it right down to the two people left who were still port in the cheers of the extreme wing of the newspaper industry, and of course the most embedded and entrenched Brexit supporters. They are the heroes, Rees-Mogg and Johnson, and they have both collectively climbed up onto a high tower and urinated all over you, Rog.
Yeah, well, and a lot of other people too.
Well, obviously not just you. That would involve AIM, that I think is probably beyond both of their skill set.
He's going to have to come out today, especially, I think you interviewed him, and I think you gave him a hard time. He's got to come out to all you people and everybody and explain. But
this is where I want to put my arms around you. He will come out and he'll say stuff in his posh voice, and a certain type of person will think that because it's all posh and plausible, it's something other than utterly corrupt hokum. Look, mate, the man has given a masterclass in deceit and hypocrisy to the entire country, and there is a significant swathe of the people on your side of the argument, not you, clearly, who will thank him for the insults. And
well, look, Boris made himself a fool when he was Foreign Secretary, so once someone's like that, I haven't really got much time for him. But today is now the day where you look at Rees-Mogg and go, what's going on? What is going on? I mean,
it is for you, Rog. It's not for me. Today is the day when I look at Rees-Mogg and point to him and say to you, you see, Roger, why didn't you trust me?
Well, let me tell you two things.
Go on.
5 of us in my family are of a voting age, and 4 of them voted for Theresa May last election. I said, you can't trust what they're going to do. They're going to... it was mainly about the referendum. They're not going to allow us to do it.
That's not true. Don't go all bonkers on me, Roger.
Right. Well, listen,
it's not a question of allowing and not allowing. Theresa May would have loved to get it through. The first thing she had to do was abolish freedom of movement. The minute she did that, this agreement was all that was available, and it's worse than membership. So you should have changed your mind by now.
One thing I think you should be fair to all of us on, we didn't make the rules of this election. We didn't allow the referendum, and Dave Cameron made it crystal clear. He said it so many times in the few weeks before the referendum. Be clear, this is all in or all out. So he said it wasn't us. mere mortals.
No, I'm with you on that. If you're inviting me to join you in considering David Cameron to be arguably the only man whose villainy stands comparison with Rhys Morgan Johnson, then mate, I'm all in, Roger. Seriously, but I'll buy a ticket.
I mean,
I did start with him, but he's not a player in the game at the moment. The only two players in the game that we're discussing today are the two players who last week were describing the offside rule as being a terrible blight upon the beautiful game, and this week they're describing it as the best available option, and they're definitely going to vote for it. Roger, you must have changed your mind by now.
No, well, look,
no?
I think, would you agree with me?
Yes.
That the only way that we're going to get what Cameron said a Leave victory would mean, the only way to get that is if we had a general election or when one comes up. And
God, no. No, I'll take another vote on this specific issue, but when it comes to the thought of another general election, I think we're all Brenda from Bristol now. Roger, mind how you go. 10:56 is the time. 03456060973. I don't know whether should we take votes on which is our favourite. Yeah, this is a contender for me.
That it is not so much the vassal state anymore as the slave state. In this arrangement, we can only leave the customs union with the permission of the European Union, which is a worse situation than we're currently in.
There you go, right there. This is a worse situation than we're currently in. For this man to stand up in public and say to you, someone who trusted him, I'm now going to vote to make things worse than they currently are, is precisely what I meant yesterday when I described the debasement of democracy. So all you've got left is the feeling, because the facts are, as just relayed by J-Dog, the facts are that this is worse than what we currently have. It's not me saying that, it's him. Those are the facts. So all you've got left is the feeling that somehow it's worth it and has to be done, despite the fact that Jacob Rees-Mogg has described it as worse than what we have. Indeed, he goes so far as to call it a slave state. Paul's in Wolverhampton. Paul, facts or feelings?
Well, facts. Rees-Mogg and Johnson are easy targets today because events have overtaken them and they've been forced to move their position.
Facts, not feelings, remember?
Yeah, you've got a Remain Parliament today that's going to vote on a whole series.
Dude, we've been over this a million times, Paul. I just want you to tell me, because clearly you're still trying to cling to some notion of support for these two characters. How do you do that?
For Brexit, not for Rees-Mogg and Johnson.
Yes, but they've described what they're going to vote for as worse than being in the European Union, and they're the two most famous Brexiters in the country.
You skillfully pick those sound bites to make them appear stupid.
There's no skill, mate. Seriously.
Well done.
Yeah.
Well done, but the bottom line is,
go on.
If they don't vote for May's withdrawal plan, then Brexit is potentially lost because of what's happening in Parliament.
Well, exactly, but they've said that this plan is worse.
To move their position.
It's worse than being in. Paul, you have to listen to me, just very briefly.
But the events when the facts change, James...
The facts haven't changed. It's still worse than being in. What fact has changed?
Why? Because Brexit is lost.
No, what fact has changed since they described it as worse than being in the European Union, both of them? What fact has changed?
The fact that a Remain Parliament...
No. They described the withdrawal agreement as being worse than being in the European Union. What fact has changed?
Well, that's only in the transition period. You still get Brexit...
No, that you're describing things that haven't changed now. So you said when the facts change, I changed my mind. It's one of my favourite phrases. They have described what they are about to vote for on the record in public as being worse than membership of the European Union. They're about to vote for something that they consider to be worse than membership of the European Union. Those were the facts. You think those are no longer the facts. Which bit has changed?
Well, that's when they were in opposition to the withdrawal agreement, and they were trying to sell that opposition.
So what fact has changed about what's in the withdrawal agreement? Has any word within it changed?
Only the last set of assurances that May got at the last...
Has any word within it changed?
Not to my knowledge, no.
So no words have changed, Paul, but you're on national radio claiming that the facts have changed. Just talk us through that.
Because because the political context has changed.
That's not a fact. That's a political context. The facts are the things that are written down. Of the things that are written down, Paul, what's changed?
James, it is a fact that the political context has changed completely.
But what's changed about the deal they described as worse than membership of the European Union? What's changed?
Surely you can acknowledge that the political context has changed entirely.
Oh, sweetheart. Let me try again. Is it still worse than membership of the European Union?
In the short term, yes.
So they're voting to make things worse than the European Union?
That was true of May's withdrawal agreement the minute it was published, the minute it became...
So you're voting to make things worse?
In the short term,
no,
yes,
but that's a meaningless phrase. You can't prove that one way or the other. Okay, well, no. And then to secure Brexit, we're back to the feelings. I'm going to have one more go. All right.
There's no feelings, James. It's a fact. It's a fact of the political context changing that they've been forced to move their position. I agree. Well, you can keep. They've got no option.
Oh, sweetheart.
Otherwise, Brexit is lost.
Yes. Okay, mate. Have a lovely day. It's worse than what we've currently got, and Paul's all for it because. It's something about being in the short term, possibly. Oh, mate, seriously, nothing but love for you, and the appalling corruption that's been visited upon you by these people. All three of them, actually. I think Roger was right. Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and don't you go skulking off into the distance, David Cameron. We'll park Brexit now reluctantly. It's crikey. You know that my predictions are just speculative since Christmas. Prior to Christmas, it was based on understanding stuff and not being in thrall to the spibs and the liars. Or simply the people who didn't understand things but felt somehow qualified to stand up in public and say things like Digby Pudding-Jones saying, I know I'm right. I haven't seen him for a while. Presumably he's not hanging his head in shame. He's just sitting by the phone waiting for another invitation to talk utter twaddle on national broadcasters. But you know what's going to happen. Come here a minute. If you had to pick a conclusion that best reflected and encapsulated... I had this thought while talking to the chap in Wolverhampton a moment ago. If you had to pick a conclusion that best encapsulated the madness of the last 3 years, there's quite a lot to be said for the idea, isn't there? That we're going to end up with a Brexit described by the top Brexiteers as worse than remaining. That's what oh boy, that's what we've done to ourselves. Whoa. We're going to end up, if she gets it through, and I mean, I'm split in three personally on what's going to happen next. I've got no idea, but I'm just sort of working on the principle that Brexit, since June 2016, has essentially delivered the most delusional, the most bonkers results, whatever the calculation has been. I think, and I will say this on the record, that if we end up with a Brexit described in terms by the most prominent Brexiters as being worse than remaining in the European Union, that's the only Brexit that could properly reflect the utter absurdity of the last 3 years. What do we want? Brexit that's worse than remaining. When do we want it? When you're ready? When they let us? Oh, my days. What have we done to ourselves? What an utterly ridiculous exercise in international humiliation. We're going to get a Brexit that Rees-Mogg and Johnson, and everybody, frankly, knows is worse than being in. And it's going to get voted for in our parliament. Maybe. That is a speculative prediction, not an evidence-based one, all right? So it doesn't get filed under all the stuff I said about the red lines and the Good Friday Agreement and freedom of movement and regulatory alignment and all the other stuff, all right? This is speculative and a little bit mischievous. But goodness me, it's seductive, isn't it? That notion that if you truly had to pick something that reflected the madness of the last 3 years, it would be a Brexit that Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson have both described as worse than being in. And, I mean, to understand how we've ended up here, you need to speak to more people like Paul a moment ago in Wolverhampton, who has that simple reality described to him and insists that it's still desirable because feelings. Shall we move on, talk about something else? It's 8 minutes after 11, and thank you for all the kind words. It's really not difficult, although I don't want to denigrate the efforts of my producer, to find the evidence that we played out on the programme today it doesn't need an archivist's skills, because it's been at the fairly near the top of the news agenda and in our bulletins and our headlines and interviews on this radio station. The clips of Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg describing what they're about to do as leading the nation into slavery, as vassal state stuff, as a historic mistake, as nonsense that we would have to implement that is not democracy. All of these clips are incredibly easy to find, although I see it as a public service in what we now call the post-Raab period of this programme's history. I see it as a public service to collect them all together and put them in one neat and digestible capsule. So we'll be doing that, I'm sure, later today.